My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and I lead our bumblebee conservation programs. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hello, I'm Leif Richardson. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. I'm based in Riverside, California, and I lead the California Bumble Bee Atlas.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy Dolan. I am in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I lead the Mountain States Bumble Bee Atlas, which is Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada.
Hey everyone, my name is Michelle Toshack. I'm a conservation biologist with Xerces, coming at you from Livingston, Montana.
Hi everyone, my name is Katie Lamke. I help coordinate the Great Plains and Midwest Bumble Bee Atlas, and I'm based in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Hey everyone, my name is Genevieve Pugesek. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I support the Midwestern Bumble Bee Atlas. I work primarily in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Bernstein. I am a researcher at the University of Minnesota, so I'm one of the project partners that's working on the Minnesota Bumble Bee Atlas.
Hi everyone, this is actually my first week at Xerces as a conservation biologist. I'm based in East Tennessee, and I'm going to be the coordinator for the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. We have just an incredible team of folks here presenting for you today, and it's going to be so great to listen to this. So we're going to spend the next hour and 23 minutes, hopefully, talking to you about bumblebee ecology and conservation. We're just going to go ahead and dive right in here. I've got a couple slides that I'm going to present, and then I'm just going to pass it off to Elise, and we'll jump right into bumblebee ecology. So thank you and welcome. And yeah, that's great. As you heard in our introduction, the vast majority of us do work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We're a nonprofit. We were formed in the 1970s by a gentleman by the name of Bob Pyle. Our mission is to conserve invertebrates and their habitat to make the world a better place, essentially, is what we're trying to do out here. And this team of incredible conservation biologists is able to bring this content to you and then also share it with federal and state agencies that are helping to make land management decisions across the country. We have a number of different programs that help to inform our work. All of us here on this call work for the Endangered Species Program, and our role is to advocate for imperiled invertebrates and to institute science or advocacy or whatever it needs to institute the protections necessary to help them to recover. We also have a pollinator program that focuses mostly on working lands. A lot of those folks are NRCS partner biologists, and they're working with farmers trying to help them increase insect biodiversity on their farms. We have a firefight program, a freshwater mussel program, and then we also have a pesticide program that sort of serves as an umbrella over all of those different programs, helping us to understand that major threat that so many invertebrates face. Yeah, next slide, please, Lise. The Xerces Society is a member-supported organization. If you are a Xerces Society member, I just want to give my sincere thanks to you for helping to support our work. It is really our members' support that helps to make these programs possible. And if I'm to be frank, in the current atmosphere of a time when it seems that biodiversity is less and less valued, especially at the federal level, the support from our members means more now than it ever has before. So thank you so much. If you're already a member, if you would like to consider joining us and becoming a member and help supporting our Bumblebee Atlas programs and all of the other work that we do, please consider visiting the URL on this slide here, xerces.org/donate, and consider the different membership options that we have. And with that, I will say once again, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it over to Elise, and please enjoy the next hour and a half of Bumblebee Ecology and Conservation.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Rich. So to kick things off, I wanted to talk a little bit about why invertebrates. Why are we focusing on invertebrates? Why are they so important? So invertebrates represent about 95% of the known biodiversity on Earth. So of all the plants, mammals, fungi, birds, all of the living things, 95% of those organisms are invertebrates, and they exist in nearly all of our ecosystems and have a lot of important different roles. So sometimes that looks like decomposition. They can be responsible for biocontrol. They're important at the base of food chains. And what we're going to be mostly focusing on today is pollination services. So, there are a lot of these different beneficial services that invertebrates provide to us. Only about 2% of all insects are pests. The rest of them are beneficial to humans or important in food webs in other ways, providing us with these different services that I have just mentioned. And recent figures indicate that there are more than 200 million insects per each human on the planet. So insects are super, super abundant, and they're very important in all of our ecosystems. So while we are primarily going to be focusing on bumblebees today, I just wanted to zoom out here for a few slides to kind of give you a broader introduction or overview of pollinators in general, and then we'll kind of zoom back in on bumblebees specifically. So why are pollinators important? The first major role that they play is in helping plants reproduce. So pollinators, are visiting flowers as they're out foraging on the landscape, and they're moving pollen around, which is helping to facilitate reproduction in plants, which allows for the production of fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds. We know that diversity of plants is super, super important, not only in large natural areas, but as well as more urban gardens or smaller urban areas. Plants play a lot of other important roles in our ecosystems. They help to cycle nutrients in soils, provide stability to soils. They can help to filter water, and the above ground part of the vegetation, so the pretty part that we get to see, is important because it can sequester carbon. And the more diverse an ecosystem is, the better it will be equipped to handle change. Diverse ecosystems are more resilient, and pollinators play a huge role when it comes to maintaining that resilience. Resilience is really important now, especially when we think about the disturbances and disruptions that are expected as our climate is changing, and what different future climate scenarios might look like. And the value of pollination extends far beyond just helping plants reproduce. So plants themselves are super important to our ecosystems, but they also help to sustain lots of different types of wildlife. So the fruits and seeds that are produced by plants can serve as food for wildlife. So this can support songbirds and small mammals, but also really large mammals like grizzly bears as well. 25% of bird and mammal diets consist of pollinator-produced seeds or fruits. Pollinators themselves play a really important role in food chains. 96% of songbirds are rearing their young on invertebrates, so they're consuming insects to feed to their young. For example, a pair of chickadees has to gather 10,000 caterpillars to feed their young. And beyond just food, pollinator habitat can provide wildlife with things like shelter as well. So they're meeting multiple needs that wildlife have for both food and shelter. So about 85% of flowering plants require an animal for pollination, and that animal is primarily an insect. There are some other creatures like birds and bats that are also pollinators, but the majority of them are insects. And for all of the reasons I've just mentioned, pollinators are organisms that are considered a keystone species. They play a disproportionately large role in their environment. And without pollinators, our world and our ecosystems would function quite a bit differently. There are 6 main groups of insect pollinators. So this includes butterflies, flies, You can see this fly here in this image is something that's often sometimes mistaken for a bee. It's got sort of similar color patterns, but this is a fly. Moths, wasps, beetles, and bees are the 6 main groups of insect pollinators. But bees are our most effective pollinator. They are the only insect to consume both nectar and pollen as both larvae and adults. Nectar is their carbohydrate source, protein is their pollen source, and almost all bees are reliant on these floral resources to survive. The adults are intentionally gathering pollen on flowers to bring back to their nests to feed to their young. Bees also have evolved special features to help them collect and transport this pollen efficiently. Different species of bees have different structures to help them collect pollen. For some bees, it's these sort of brushes on their hind legs, sometimes on the side of their thorax that kind of looks like it's in their armpits. For some bees, it's on the underside of their abdomen. This image here shows the corbicula, which is also known as a pollen basket that bumblebees have. It's sort of this hollow groove framed by these long hairs where the bumblebees can pack pollen in to carry home with them. So here's an example of a bumblebee who's got lots of pollen, a very full pollen basket on her hind legs. You can kind of think of this as she's bringing all of her groceries, so she's getting all of her groceries on one trip. Another important thing that bees do that make them such effective pollinators is they exhibit something called a flower constancy. So this is the tendency of a bee to visit one type of flower during a foraging visit. So the bees are sort of avoiding wasting time as they're learning to handle the flower. So different flowers have different floral structures, and the bees need to learn how to access the nectar rewards. So when they visit the same flower, they're not having to sort of learn how to access that reward every time. This benefits the flowers as well because the bee is then collecting and depositing necessary pollen. So she's gathering that pollen for herself, but depositing pollen that can help that plant as well. And bees are super, super diverse. I think a lot of folks often picture either honeybees or bumblebees, some sort of fuzzy insect that's got black and yellow stripes, but bees represent lots of different shapes and sizes and colors. There are about 20,000 species of bees worldwide, about 5,200 species in North America, and about 3,600 species of bees in the United States. Here's a pie chart made by some of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab that is meant to really represent the diversity of wild bees that we have in the United States. And there are a few different ways that we can categorize bees, one of which is size. So bees can be really, really tiny. Bumblebees are one of our larger species of bees. They can also be categorized based on the way that they collect pollen. So I mentioned this just briefly, but different types of bees collect pollen in different ways based on the structures they have on their body. So bumblebees and honeybees have those corbicula or pollen baskets on their hind legs. Other bees, like digger bees or mining bees, might have those scopa or brushes of pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs. Leafcutter bees have pollen collecting hairs on the undersides of their abdomens. Another way to categorize bees is their tongue length. So this varies from long to short, and this is important because it relates to the type of plants they're able to visit and how they're able to access nectar from flowers. Different life history traits, like where they nest, are other ways that we can categorize bees. The majority of our bees are ground nesting, so about 70 to 80% of bees nest below ground in the soil. Another handful of these wild bees are nesting in hollow cavities like plant stems, sometimes holes in rotting wood, and some bees even choose to nest in abandoned rodent burrows. Another way that we sort of think of bees is their sociality. So some bees are social, meaning they live in a colony with this caste system of a queen, workers, and males. But the majority of bees are solitary, meaning that there's a single female who creates a nest, lays eggs, and provisions that nest. And this category is quite a broad spectrum. Some bees are totally social, some are semi-social, some are social but kind of nest very close to one another. It's very complex. Jenny will talk a little bit more in a little bit about those specifics of bumblebee nesting. What I want you all to take away from this pie chart today is that, how diverse bees can be, and that while we are focused on bumblebees, they represent only 1.4% of the known 3,600 species of bees in the US. Of course, they are still important, but there are a lot of other bees out there on the landscape. There are 47 species of bumblebees in North America. They are the most diverse in the western montane areas. So this is represented by the green areas on the map. So the Sierras, the Cascades, the Rocky Mountains, the Black Hills, those areas have a lot of species of bumblebees. So each of these states listed in this bullet points, or in these bullet points here, shows how many species have been documented to exist. It's also important to note that survey effort varies in different parts of the country. So some parts of the US have had really thorough surveys and coverage in terms of helping us understand the distribution of these different species. And the Bumblebee Atlas, that's one of the goals, is to kind of fill in these gaps and have these equal effort surveys to get a better idea of the bumblebees we have distributed across North America. So what sets bumblebees apart from other wild bees? So one of the first things is their physiology. So bumblebees are relatively large bees, and they have large muscles. So they're able to use those muscles to help generate heat, basically by shivering. And this means that they're able to fly often in cooler or wetter conditions. And they're also able to be active earlier as well as later in the day when then compared to other pollinators. Bumblebees are intelligent as well. So this photo here is from a video where bumblebees were taught to roll balls down a path in order to gain a nectar reward. And they were able to sort of learn to choose the shorter path when they were presented with different options. Bumblebees have long tongues, and they can access a variety of floral resources. So they're what we consider generalist pollinators. They visit lots of different flowers, but they're able to access nectar from flowers that have long tubular flower parts, like bee balm, for example. And bumblebees are also innovative and are able to sort of use their strength to their advantage. Because they are such large bees, they could use their strength to sort of pry open flowers like bottle gentian, for example, or manipulate flowers that are a little bit more rigid. And they can also do something cool called buzz pollination, which Leif will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes here. With that, I will hand things over to Leif to talk about the bumblebee life cycle and some more foraging specific things.
All right, thank you. I will share my screen. Okay. Does that look okay, panelists? Yeah, all right, great. Okay, I'm going to talk about the bumblebee life cycle and then a little bit about the foraging life history of the bees. So these are annual, they're social insects with an annual colony cycle. So everything happens during one growing season, and the intervening colder periods or drier periods of the year, one single bee is spending that time underground. That is the queen. So let's talk a little bit more about those colonies. These colonies are founded de novo every spring by a queen, which is the name we give for females who reproduce in bumblebees. It's a name of one of the roles or castes in the colony. She comes out of the ground in the springtime and founds a colony. And that colony will only last until she reproduces towards the end of the growing season. The other castes or roles in the colony include females who normally don't reproduce, those are workers, and males. We also have newly produced reproductive females, which we call gines, or we just call them queens. You'll hear us say that today. And so let's see, the nests are usually below ground in hollow preformed cavities, usually an abandoned rodent burrow, but they are very generalized in where they can nest. And so we do see them nesting in all kinds of other situations below ground. Also on the surface of the ground, and some species will nest in trees or birdhouses or other anthropogenic structures above ground. It's important to remember that for most of those nesting situations, the bees live in complete darkness, and there is a ton of coordination and communication that's going on. So lots of communication that is tactile, lots of communication that's pheromone based, and not so much that is visual, even though these guys have great eyes for seeing when they are outside of the colony. So every bumblebee goes through 4 basic stages of development, starting with eggs at the top there. The eggs are about the size and shape of a grain of white rice, and the bees put them inside of a little wax cup, which is torn open in this image. They hatch, they go through, I think, 4 different stages of larval life where they just eat food that's presented to them by their sisters, the workers, if they are there, or their mom, the queen, if the workers have not emerged yet. They eventually spin a cocoon, just like a butterfly, a pupa we call it, and it takes, I don't know, 6 to 9 days for them to pupate. They start as a little grub and they come out as a fully formed adult. It's really pretty amazing. Adults might live 3 weeks. That's a typical thing you see as an estimate for wild bees. In the lab, you can get bumblebees to live for months. And so more about the division of labor in the colony. This is a foundational part of social life for animals, including us, right? When a lot of cooperation is necessary and there's lots of work to do, sometimes it makes good sense to specialize on the job that you do. And so in insect societies, we see the evolution of these this caste differentiation or role differentiation. And as I said earlier, there are queens who are the reproducers in the colony. The only we didn't mention it, but the male that she mated with the previous year will be the other reproductive individual in the nest. She produces workers of a variety of sizes. Large workers tend to go outside and do lots of foraging. They can fly farther and they can carry more weight. Small workers, we say here, within colony tasks, and that's true. They act as the nurse bees and take care of larvae, but they also go outside and forage and have important foraging roles out of the nest. And then males reproduce. So they leave the nest that they're born in, they feed themselves and find mates. And that is most of what male bumblebees do. There is some evidence that male bumblebees will contribute to the incubation of their nestmates, of their siblings, which is really cool. Something that we didn't think that males in social insect societies would have any business doing, but they are. So I'm going to go now through the colony cycle with this little image from one of our colleagues, Jeremy Hemberger. And we'll start at the upper left-hand corner where the queen is in her hibernaculum, which is not a preformed rodent burrow that she found below ground in most cases. It is in fact a shallow burrow that this bee digs for herself and then just sort of buries herself alive. She goes into diapause, which is a form of stasis where the metabolism drops. The bee is alive and consuming stored food resources. So she has fat in her body and also stored nectar in her digestive tract, but she's digesting it very slowly and it lasts for months. When she's monitoring temperature cues below ground, and when it's warm enough, she comes out of the nest and goes foraging for food to replenish her stores internally. And also to get food for the offspring that she'll soon be raising. So she flies around looking for a good place to found a colony. And on our next image here, we see her finding such a place. In this case, maybe it's a rodent burrow with the entrance under a rock next to a log. This is a typical sort of situation for them to nest in. When she finds that, she brings nectar and pollen mixed together in this sort of loaf, lumpy bread dough consistency, puts it in the nest site. Then she lays eggs right on top, and then she sits on those eggs and incubates them. And these are warm-blooded animals. They can shunt the hot blood to the abdomen, which is where the incubation area of the body is. And that really speeds up the development of the offspring. She'll just leave the nest to get more food when she needs to, but this is a dicey time where she has to do everything. She has to take care of the babies. She has to go shopping, if you will. She has to avoid predators and other dangerous stuff. Once the first workers come out, and it takes about 6 weeks to go from egg to adult offspring in the nest, the mom will now stay home and she will lay eggs. She'll be fed by her worker daughter offspring and groomed by them. And her main job at that point is the egg laying, but we often forget to say this. She's also using pheromones constantly to control her daughters. So she's in charge of the whole colony. And we should just stipulate that when she's below ground doing quote unquote nothing but eating and laying eggs, she's also driving the ship. So at some point, the colony gets big enough that they decide together, and I do mean the word decide, to stop making non-reproductive female workers and to start making the reproductives. And so the queen and her worker daughters have a little bit of conflict over when this should happen. We don't have time to talk about exactly why, but they have slightly different imperatives in terms of who reproduces and whether males and females are produced and what the ratio of the two is. They work that out. They produce male offspring and they produce new queens. Those leave the nest and find each other and mate outside the nest. And the queen then feeds herself and goes and hibernates in the fall. So that is the annual cycle. She's back in the ground again. There is one more thing that we want to make sure you know about that is just so cool. And that is that bumblebees, there are actually there's a whole lineage of bumblebees, the real bumblebees, that don't live like this. They are not social. They are in fact social parasites. And they attack the nest of that I just described of a regular bumblebee right around the time that the first workers, maybe the second set of workers, come out. And what they do is they enter the nest. They use pheromones, aggression, and perhaps other behaviors to dominate the workers and the queen. They sometimes will fight and kill a few of the workers. They rarely kill the queen, who rarely leaves. And then they destroy all the eggs and larvae in the nest, probably the pupa as well, by eating them. And then they lay their own eggs, and they force the host community to rear their own offspring, to forage for them, and so on. So the colony makes a right-hand turn and ends up producing nothing but parasite offspring, bumblebee offspring, but they're parasites, not the host. So really cool biology. These things have evolved for fighting and defense. They have very large mouth parts and heads. They're strong and big. Some of them have modified abdomens that put the stinger in a way that they're very good at grappling onto other bees and stinging them. And they have very thick exoskeleton, which resists being poked by the stinger of another bee. Workers can sometimes fight these guys off by stinging them collectively, and also by throwing a ton of nectar onto them, which we call honey daubing. And it's a very strange behavior. I've never seen it, but it apparently confuses the cuckoos sometimes. We call them cuckoo bumblebees, these parasites. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the needs of bees out and about on the landscape. I will be talking about where they forage and what they forage on, and then I'll turn it over to Jenny, who will talk more about nesting and other factors. So as you've heard, bumblebees eat basically two things. It's nectar and pollen, both from flowers. They are vegetarians. Their closest relatives are wasps. Wasps are meat eaters. They collect animal protein to feed to their offspring. The bumblebees do it differently. Like nearly all bees, they eat plant protein, pollen, instead of animal protein. So the way it goes is that adult bees eat a lot of nectar to fuel the flight and other stuff that they do, and a little pollen because they need protein. And then larval bees eat a lot of pollen and some nectar. There's some other stuff in nectar and pollen that we don't have time to talk about, but briefly, and that's the plus here on the slide, there are non-protein amino acids in the nectar, which sometimes some of them have impacts on bee health. There are plant secondary metabolites like nicotine or other alkaloids that exist in the nectar of these plants and in the pollen that have impacts on bees, both negative and positive. All told, these things kind of communicate to the potential pollinators and result in the plants becoming better pollinated. One thing that regulates what bumblebees can eat is how long their tongue is. So it's flowers, right? But they have to stick this straw down into the depths of the flower to get the nectar out, and they suck it out just like a straw. Some of them have quite small tongues, and some have very long tongues. So the longest tongues are more than twice the size of the shorter tongues. This varies between species. Not surprisingly, but also between bees of different body size. So within one colony, you do have a range of tongue sizes within that species range. And the length of the tongue affects how many different types of flowers they can feed on, and thus it affects the competition that they experience from other flower feeders. There's a fascinating study that shows that climate change is impacting tongue length in some bumblebees in Colorado and probably elsewhere in the West. The way this works is that climate change is causing drought, which is causing changes in the plant community. The bees have different things to eat, and they are very quickly evolving through natural selection to have different shaped tongues to exploit those nectar resources. So this is not a good thing. It's good that bees are flexible, but this is on the order of 40 to 50 years, I think, so quite short in terms of evolution. Now, there are lots of flowers with really deep corollas, as we call the flower petals when they're together, and others, of course, with very short distances to the nectar. The graphic from a peer-reviewed publication on the left shows a bumblebee reaching up to where the nectar is in these flowers called monk's hood. That's a long-tongue bumblebee job right there. Short tongue will not reach that nectar. And then the center picture there, those are tiny little flowers, and you can see that part of the mouth parts of the bee are not inside of the flower corolla; they're actually outside. So, long-tongue bees could use both types of flowers, and short-tongue bees basically can only use the short ones. However, the long-tongue bees are less efficient at working the short flowers, so we do see some differentiation based on efficiency. Now, bees that have short tongues, you would think maybe they're restricted to the short flowers, but in fact, there's this fascinating thing that is pretty common in bumblebees called nectar robbing. And here's a short video showing the rusty patch bumblebee, which is one of these very short-tongued bees. And this is how she forages on this particular plant, Monarda, or bee balm. And so she's just tearing a hole in the base of every one of those flowers and shortcutting the reproductive structures. And you can actually see the male and female parts that are sticking out of the mouth of the flower. She's maybe touching some of them, but not all of them. And so this potentially can result in less pollination for the plant. And so in this case, the bees are not pollinators, but maybe they are robbers or non-mutualistic flower visitors. But we found out that in some nectar robbing systems, the bees are pollinators nonetheless. And for example, that can be because they land on the sexual parts of the plant, and then they walk to the back and make the hole. And so there are mixed outcomes for plants. Another fascinating bit of foraging behavior that bumblebees have that many other types of bees also have, honeybees notably do not have, is buzz pollination or sonication in order to get the flower to release the pollen. There's a whole series of plants that can only release their pollen when they're vibrated like this. And in this slowed down video, you can see the bee is vibrating her flight muscles, causing an audible buzz, shaking the plant. And it causes these banana-shaped anthers with little holes at the end to shoot the pollen out onto the bee's body, after which she will groom it into those pollen sacs. It's super cool. It's easy to observe, and they do it on a wide variety of plants. Here are some examples. The family that includes tomatoes and peppers and other similar things is a great place to look for these bees doing this. Blueberries and cranberries and other heath family plants. Squashes can be buzzed. Shooting stars, if you live in a place with that wildflower, they're a fun place to watch this behavior. It goes on and on. There are many thousands of plants that these guys will work this way. So those plants are functionally nectar only for bees that can't buzz them because the pollen is stuck up inside of these poricidal anthers. And so for here, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who will talk about nesting.
Thanks so much, Leif. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, and my fellow panelists, can you see my screen share? Awesome. I saw Leif nod.
Looks good, Jenny. Yep.
Great. For the next part of the talk, I'm going to walk you through some of the other types of resources bumblebees need from their environments. Before we dive in, I really want to emphasize that we don't know a lot about bumblebee nesting, overwintering, or mating because it's really hard to find bumblebee nests and overwintering sites. But I am going to take you through what we do know about these different resource needs. And let's jump into bumblebee nesting. So bumblebees are cavity nesters. They need a largish, for a bee at least, a largish space in which to rear their brood. They are social insects, so they need a relatively large room to do that. They can use lots of different substrates as nesting material. Basically, they need a shelter from the elements and some sort of insulating material. So they can use places like rodent burrows or nests, bird nests or houses, tree stumps, rotten logs, or hollow trees as their nesting sites. They can also use anthropogenic environments, so places like compost piles. Bumblebees have been found to nest in walls and the insulation. Last year in the Midwest, somebody found a bumblebee nest in an abandoned tractor. So they can use lots of different places for nesting. Lots of researchers consider bumblebees to be nesting habitat generalists because they can use these different sorts of places to nest. However, there are some differences between species and where we generally find their nests. Most of the time, the most common place to find bumblebee nest is going to be under the ground. Most bumblebee nests are subterranean, using abandoned rodent burrows beneath the ground surface. There are some species that you're generally going to find nesting below the ground most of the time. So the rusty patch bumblebee, for example, the common eastern bumblebee, those are subterranean nesting species. Some subterranean nests can be pretty shallow. There'll be a really short entrance into the nest, and the nest won't be that deep below the ground. But rodent burrows can be really extensive, and so if you are going to go out and dig up one of these nests, you might end up doing a lot of digging. The image here that you see on your right shows some researchers digging up a bumblebee nest. I've participated in an excavation of a nest previously, and I could literally lay in the hole that we dug out just because it was such a large area. So it's really cool to think about all of the things that are going down below the ground for these species. A lot of their life is happening beneath the surface of the ground and we just can't see it. Some species of bumblebees generally nest on the surface of the ground. So you can see an image here of a surface nesting bumblebee species. This is an American bumblebee nest. The bumblebee nest is right underneath that patch of thatchy grass. So the nest itself is just resting on the surface of the soil, and then it's covered up by all of this insulating grass. It's kind of like they have a little cottage with a thatched roof on top. So the nest itself is either resting on the surface of the ground, sometimes it could be slightly embedded in the soil, but generally these surface nests are going to be covered by some kind of vegetation, so something like grass, or in some cases moss, so that they're protected from the elements. Some bumblebee nests you will find pretty high off the ground, so in places like hollow trees or in bird nests. And these nests aren't making any contact in the soil with all. They're completely above ground nests. Bumblebee nests are quite cryptic. As I mentioned, some of their activity is going on completely below the surface of the ground, and so we can't see everything that's happening down there. Whenever I've found a nest, what I've cued in on is the worker activity. So I'm just going to show you a short video of what that looks like. So here we have some workers leaving the nest entrance. And that is all there is to it. So they can be pretty difficult to find, but what that means is when you do find one, it's really exciting. Bumblebees are vulnerable to predation at their nest sites. Nest sites can be destroyed by animals like skunks who are going to want to dig up the nest so that they can go ahead and eat the colony. It's a pretty tasty treat. It's full of larvae and pollen and nectar. So if a nest site like this is destroyed, that colony may not go on to reproduce, to go on to produce new queens and drones, which is bad for the bees. As I mentioned previously, bumblebee nests are pretty hard to locate, but there's a lot that we can still learn from observing queen bumblebees as they search for nest sites. So as Leif mentioned, during the springtime, queen bumblebees will go out and try to find a place in which they nest, and their behavior when they're doing that is really distinct. They will fly in almost a zigzag pattern across the ground, stopping occasionally to check out a spot they think could potentially be a nest site. So if you're going outside right now and you're seeing some queens, look out for this behavior. It's really neat to see them as they engage in this. Sometimes you'll also see queen bumblebees look for nest sites by flying up and down the trunks of trees. So if you look up, you may see a queen bumblebee doing that around this time as well. So bumblebees also need places to mate. The first step in mating is finding a mate, and how bumblebees find mates is dependent on the species. Bumblebees engage in different kinds of courtship behaviors to find mates. Some species of bumblebees, the males will engage in this behavior called patrolling and scent marking. Basically, they'll just fly around in a circuit, stepping down occasionally to scent mark a leaf or something like that, so that they can attract queens and bring them into the area where they're doing this behavior. And you will see them sometimes flying around in these sort of almost circle shapes, stopping occasionally to scent mark a leaf. That's that patrolling and scent marking behavior. Other bumblebee species will engage in perching behaviors to find mates. So this is really common among the species that have really large eyes. So the brown-belted bumblebee, black and gold bumblebee, if the males have large eyes, they're often engaging in this behavior to find mates. And basically what they do is just find a really tall plant or a tree branch and hang out and wait for a female to fly by. And if they see anything that looks like it could potentially be a queen bumblebee, they'll go after it. So birds, other flying insects, anything that is just flying by, they will try to check out and see if it could potentially be a queen bumblebee. And I'm going to show you a video of what that looks like. So here we have a male perching, waiting for something to fly by. Oh, off he goes. He saw something that he potentially thought could be a queen. The other courtship behavior that males will engage in is nest entrance waiting. So males will find a nest and wait outside of the entrance of that nest for new queens to emerge. And then they'll fight each other and try to go after the queens as they leave their nest sites. Sometimes they'll even enter the nest to mate with queens within the nest itself. So where are they engaging in mating? So in some species, mating is happening near or within the nest, and so we can think of their nesting habitat as also being their mating habitat. Other species are not going to be mating near the nest, but in general, you will be if you find a mating pair, they're going to be mating on the ground or on some sort of vegetation. This image here is Southern Plains bumblebee mating pair perched on goldenrod. All right, the last resource I want to talk about is overwintering resources. Bumblebees need places to spend the winter. We don't have a ton of records of overwintering queen locations. Most of the time when people have found overwintering queens, they found them in the soil, not very deep, just a few inches underneath the soil or within the leafy duff, sort of underneath trees. They'll be right underneath all of the duff, almost on top of the soil. I think there's a few records of queens that have been found in rotting wood. For folks who have found queens, they have seen, they found queens on north-facing slopes in some instances, but there is a lot that we don't know about their overwintering habitat needs, just because it's so hard to find queens when they're overwintering in the soil. As Leif mentioned, bumblebee queens excavate their hibernacula themselves. The hibernacula is the place where they spend the winter. And I'm just going to show you a short video of what that looks like. This queen bumblebee is digging out a little shallow cavity in the soil, and she's going to spend the entire winter in that spot. Yeah, as Leif mentioned, you're going to bury yourself alive, and then come springtime, she will emerge from her overwintering quarters and go out and try to find a place to nest, start foraging. So we can see them when they are engaging in those activities, but not so much when they are overwintering. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot we don't know about bumblebee ecology, especially when it comes to some of these more cryptic life cycle stages, like nesting and overwintering. We don't know a lot about nesting biology for some species. We know very little about how well colonies survive outside. You know, are they experiencing lots of pressures from things like predation or management activities like prescription fire or mowing? We don't know a lot about their survival rates during diapause and hibernation. We also don't know a lot about dispersal of queens and males or where they are mating and their reproductive habits, which is where you guys can come in and help us out. You can help us collect data on these different life cycle stages. If you're somebody who's planning to participate in the Atlas, if you upload your observations to Bumblebee Watch, there's a place for you to make notes if you see anything really cool when you are out doing a survey. You can upload a picture of something like a mating pair of bumblebees, and with that photo you can make a note that you saw two bumblebees engaging in a reproductive behavior or something like that, and that helps us learn more about these stages of their life cycle. You also have the option to submit observations of nests if you happen to find one. If you do find a nest, please take lots of photos. It's really helpful if you take a photo of the nest site as well as at least one bumblebee that's using the nest. If we don't have a photo of the bumblebee itself, we can't confirm what species of bumblebee was using that nest site. So it's really helpful to have lots of photos. If you're in an area where you have permission to catch bumblebees, it is great to catch one of those workers or males as they're leaving the nest and then just photographing it as you would a bumblebee that you've caught for an Atlas survey. It really is helpful when we're trying to confirm the species that's using the nest site. You also will want to take some notes on the location of the nest. What is the latitude and longitude, where you saw it, what is the surrounding habitat, how much nest traffic there is. Every time I find a nest site, I always try to watch it for a little while because sometimes they will have different nest entrances and you need to observe them to figure out exactly what's going on with that nest. If you do submit a nest observation to Bumblebee Watch, you'll be asked a bunch of different questions about the nest site. We really encourage you to fill out all of that information so we can glean as much information as we can from these really rare observations. In addition to making notes on behavior, if you are going to submit observations to Bumblebee Watch, you can also note other cool things that you see in the field, like interactions between bumblebees and predators and parasites. If you have ever watched bumblebees or caught lots of bumblebees, you may have seen these mites that are sometimes all over their bodies. A lot of parasites of bumblebees, you can't visually see them with the naked eye, but mites are one thing that you can see if you are collecting bumblebees in the field. To our knowledge, for the most part, these mites are mostly harmless. They're not actively harming the bumblebees, but they are still a parasite that they are exposed to that can some bumblebees can have a lot of mites on them. So be sure to make a note of that if you encounter a bumblebee with a lot of parasites that you can see like that. You can also make notes on the predators that you observe in the field of bumblebees. So I mentioned that bumblebee nests can be predated by animals like skunks. Bumblebee workers can also be predated by other animals. So things like crab spiders or ambush bugs, robber flies will kill and eat the workers. And then bumblebees can also be parasitized by different types of flies. So if you observe these things in the field, we want to know about it. Please make a note of it in your observation notes if you are going to be participating in the Atlas this year. And that wraps up my slides. I can hand it off to the next person.
Thanks, Jenny. So I am the next person. I'm gonna share my slides. All right, thanks, Jenny. Everyone, Michelle, Katie, and I are going to take you through the second half of this webinar, the conservation portion of this webinar. We're going to share the story of bumblebee declines, threats that they face, conservation efforts that are underway, what anyone can do to help, and the important positive impact of Bumble Bee Atlas volunteers. Bumblebee research and observations have been occurring for a long time. We have bumblebee specimens in natural history museums going back into the 1800s. For many years, entomologists collected and studied these fascinating animals, learning about their diversity, their habitats, their distributions, and their life cycles. But starting in the early to mid-1990s, some researchers started to notice they weren't seeing certain species of once common bumblebees in the places they expected them to be. It turns out there were 4 species that seemed to be experiencing significant declines. These were the western bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and the rusty patch bumblebee. A puzzling fact about the observed declines was that these 4 species have very different ranges. The western bumblebee was widely distributed across the western US and Canada. Franklin's bumblebee had a very small range known only from northern California and southern Oregon. The yellow-banded bumblebee's range stretched from the east coast south through Appalachia, then north and west into the northern plains of Canada. And the rusty patch bumblebee was known from New England, west to the northern plains, and south through Georgia. Another fact that stood out to researchers at the time was that these 4 species are closely related. We currently classify them all into the same subgenus. This relatedness led to the hypothesis that the declines had a biological cause. We now think that pathogens were a major factor. Unfortunately, these 4 species were not the only ones to be found in decline around that time. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature formed the Bumblebee Specialist Group. This group of experts currently is made up of more than 70 scientists in 10 regions around the globe. The goal of the Bumblebee Specialist Group is to complete research to better understand the extinction risk of bumblebees worldwide. In North America, the Bumblebee Specialist Group is made up of leading bumblebee experts, including several Xerces staff members. They got to work in the early 2000s on the formal process of conducting species status assessments for all North American bumblebees. This process follows a standardized procedure and uses historical data from museum specimens and scientific literature to evaluate each species' risk of extinction. Just over 10 years ago, this species status assessments were completed, and this graph here summarizes the results. I always like to start with the good news, and that's the green here. Of the 46 species assessed, 28, over half were ranked as species of least concern. These are bumblebees whose populations seem to be stable. The big news was the 25% of species that landed in one of the at-risk categories, from 4 considered critically endangered, 2 considered endangered, and 6 ranked as vulnerable or near threatened. There were also 5 species on which there wasn't enough data to make an assessment, so we don't really know what's going on with those rare bumblebees, and we should consider the possibility that they could be in one of those threatened categories. So which ones are at risk? This is the list of the 12 North American bumblebee species facing some risk of extinction. Some of these, like the American bumblebee and yellow bumblebee, are known from all across the continent. Others, like the rusty patch bumblebee and western bumblebee, have historic ranges just across the eastern US or the western US. and some species have much narrower ranges, like just along the Pacific coast, or in the case of Franklin's bumblebee, in only a small area of California and Oregon. 3 of our most imperiled species haven't been observed in the US for years. As far as we know, the suckly cuckoo was last seen in 2016, the variable cuckoo was last seen in 2013, and Franklin's bumblebee was last seen in 2006. Our bumblebee team is hopeful that these species are still out there somewhere, and efforts like the Bumble Bee Atlas can hopefully help us find them. All of these species have been petitioned for endangered species protection. The U.S. Endangered Species Act of 1973 was created to protect at-risk species and develop plans to help populations recover. The law provides a framework to conserve and protect endangered species and their habitats. So when a species gets listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a multi-state effort is undertaken with the ultimate goal of helping populations recover so that it can be delisted. The rusty patch bumblebee made headlines in 2017 when it became the first bee to be listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Franklin's bumblebee got endangered species protection in 2022, and in January of this year, the suckly cuckoo bumblebee has been proposed for an endangered species listing. Other species are still under review by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we know that these species are in decline, but what is causing the declines? What threats negatively impact these bumblebee species? There's really not a simple answer to this question. A lot of work is being done to better understand the cause of bumblebee declines, and expert consensus is that there's several factors working together to negatively impact these animals. And while we can't get into all insects today, it's important to note that it's not just bumblebee populations that are declining. These factors are negatively impacting many insects all across the globe. The 5 key threats we're going to talk about today are habitat loss, pathogens, pesticides, competition from commercial honeybees, and climate change. One important factor that's impacting bumblebee populations is habitat loss and fragmentation. Bumblebee colonies need flowers from early spring when the queens emerge from hibernation until fall when those new queens are preparing to overwinter. They also need, like you heard, safe places to nest, cavities like hollow logs, abandoned rodent burrows, or rock piles. And queens need loose bare soil or leaf litter for overwintering. Intact habitat can provide these essential habitat features. Unfortunately, human activity over past decades has drastically eliminated a lot of bumblebee habitat. Cities, roads, large agricultural fields, and even suburbs have replaced diverse native landscapes. And while both farms and suburban gardens are able to provide food, nesting sites, and overwintering sites, they can be considered high-risk environments for bumblebees because there's frequent disturbances, there's often a lack of diverse food resources, and often exposure to pesticides. Many scientists have been looking into how land use has changed over time and how this can impact bumblebees and other native bees. Here's one example from a study published in 2015 that looked at the status, trends, and impacts of wild bee abundance in the US. On this map, the dark blue shows high native bee abundance, and the lighter yellow color shows low native bee abundance. From 2008 to 2013, the overall abundance of native bees declined by 23%, and 60% of areas where decline was detected was where grassland had been converted into cropland. We know bees as pollinators increase seed set and overall crop yield, but in our current system, we're increasing cropland and demand for pollination while simultaneously creating less suitable habitat for those essential native pollinators. Pesticides are another factor harming bumblebees. Our landscapes are full of chemicals, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. All of these chemicals can cause harm to bumblebees and other native pollinators. And there are several ways that bumblebees can be impacted by pesticides. There can be what's called direct exposure, when a chemical lands directly on the bee. Residue contact occurs when a bee forages on a flower that has previously been treated with pesticides. And remember that bumblebees, their nests are usually found underground or in bunch grasses, brush piles, or rock piles, so spraying pesticides can also contaminate bumblebee nests. Clearly, all of these situations are not good for bees. If the chemicals don't outright kill them, there can be what we call sublethal effects, Maybe the queen is not as healthy and can't lay as many eggs. Or maybe the workers are less healthy and can't forage as effectively. Or maybe the bees' immune systems are compromised, so they are less able to fight off other pathogens. Any or all of these can lead to population declines. One particularly troubling group of pesticides are systemic insecticides. When a systemic insecticide is applied, it's taken up through the plant's roots and transported to all parts of the plant, making most or all of the plant toxic. These types of insecticides typically are aimed at plant-feeding pests like aphids and caterpillars, but insecticides are created to kill insects. That means both pests and beneficial insects will be affected. Pollen and nectar produced by a plant treated with systemic insecticides can become contaminated with these chemicals, harming or killing the bees that forage on them. We know that pesticides are harmful to bumblebees and other pollinators, and we know that these chemicals are widely used in agriculture, industry, and in homes and gardens. Tests have found pesticide contamination in honeybee pollen and in stream samples across the nation. Still, there's a lot we don't know about how these chemicals affect bumblebees and other native bees. Historically, the effects of traditional chemicals, as well as newer pesticides claiming to be safe for bees, have only been tested on honeybee colonies. This practice overlooks the impact of contaminated soil on ground nesting bees like bumblebees. Additionally, limited data on the use of pesticides, especially in homes and gardens, makes research into their impacts even more challenging. Another threat affecting bumblebees is disease. Just like any organism, bumblebees can get sick, infected with pathogens and parasites. Compounding the diseases are stressors like lack of quality food resources and pesticides, which may lower bees' immunity and make it harder for them to fight off the diseases. This is another ongoing area of research, and once again, there's a lot left to learn. Some known pathogens include fungal and protist parasites and fatal viruses like deformed wing virus and black queen cell virus. Researchers have also discovered that honeybees are able to spread their pathogens to wild bumblebee populations when they're out foraging in the same areas. Another concern related to disease is the rearing of commercial bumblebee colonies to support pollination in greenhouses. These commercially raised bumblebees can easily escape greenhouses and be found foraging on plants in the surrounding areas, leading to competition with native bees and the spread of diseases that may have been amplified in the commercial facility. Despite these concerns, this industry is not regulated in most of the US and Canada. This idea of commercial bumblebee colonies spreading pathogens to wild bees brings us back to the story of those first 4 species that sparked conservation concern by their decline in the 1990s. A leading hypothesis is that these species declined in the wild due to pathogens that spread from commercial bumblebee colonies. A study published in 2016 supported this hypothesis. At one time, the western bumblebee was being commercially reared for use in greenhouses. That industry collapsed in the late 1990s due to a fungal pathogen. It was right around the same time that there were infections and declines in wild bee populations, especially the closely related Franklin's bumblebee, yellow-banded bumblebee, and rusty patch bumblebee. Another threat affecting bumblebee populations is competition from honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America, and nearly all hives in the US are managed by humans, though feral colonies are possible, especially in warmer climates. Honeybees face similar threats and challenges as bumblebees, but they are not endangered. There are millions of honeybee hives in North America, and each colony consists of 15,000 to 80,000 individuals at any given time. These colonies cause a huge amount of competition with native bees. One study published in 2016 calculated that one honeybee hive is able to gather enough pollen to support 100,000 native solitary bees. This level of competition is especially concerning in landscapes with limited floral resources. Due to a lot of attention from the press over past decades and our dependence on honeybees in current agricultural practices, the challenges that beekeepers face are pretty well known. So well known, in fact, that many people have tried to save the bees by setting up their own honeybee hives. We need to be clear that honeybees are important and fascinating for many reasons, but beekeeping is not a way to help our wild native bees. In fact, when there's too many honeybee hives in a landscape, or when the hives are not well cared for, they can be harmful to all the bees in the area, spreading pathogens and increasing competition. The final threat I'm going to talk about today is climate change. We are witnessing drastic changes in climate resulting in drought and extreme extended heat waves. These phenomena are not good for bumblebees. When there is drought, there aren't flowers, which means no food. And the large fuzzy bodies of bumblebees make them better suited to colder climates, which means they suffer during extended periods of extremely high temperatures. Extreme high temperatures can certainly kill bumblebee individuals and bumblebee colonies, but heat waves can also have a number of other negative effects, including shorter lifespans, lower reproductive success, smaller bodies, and less efficient foraging. These images here display the results of a 2015 study concluding that climate change is making some southern parts of bumblebee ranges too hot for them to live in, but they aren't moving further north to compensate. At the same time, species that lose habitat at lower elevations do shift their ranges to higher elevations, but alpine bumblebee species are stuck. They can't move any higher. So in the northern parts of their ranges, bumblebees from high elevations are disappearing, and in the southern parts of their ranges, bumblebees at low elevations are disappearing. All this means that changing climate is causing shrinking ranges and local extirpations. And once again, there's a lot we don't know. The Bumblebee Atlas is helping us learn about current ranges and habitats and will provide baseline data sets as we monitor populations into the future. Our Bumblebee Atlas work can also support and inform the variety of research being done on all aspects of bumblebees, all the things that are left to learn. So now that I've discussed and shared with you some of this rather dismal information, I'm going to pass it off to Michelle, who will share some reasons for hope and actions we can all take to help our local bumblebee populations.
Thanks, Amy. Okay, so a lot of the threats that Amy mentioned are human-induced challenges, and there are also many human-induced solutions that we can implement for positive change. So I'll be sharing with you some of the actions that you can take to make a difference for bumblebee conservation. So there's 4 components to building habitat for bumblebees that I'll be covering today. So planting flowers and providing food for bees is the easiest single action you can take to help bumblebees. But habitat is a lot more than just flowers. We need to think about providing shelter for bumblebees by protecting their overwintering and nesting habitats. As a community, we need to think about connecting bee habitat. And the 4th component is that if we're going to establish habitat, we need to provide a non-toxic environment for bumblebees. So a few years ago, I decided to smother my lawn and plant a diversity of flowers. This quickly turned into this flower jungle. So the sunflowers and the Rocky Mountain bee balm, they kind of took over. They grew over 6 feet tall. This is kind of a fun game because you can actually see some bumblebees on the flowers if you look carefully. So one morning I was sipping coffee and watching bees, as you do, and I found this unusual looking bee that ended up being the 2-spotted bumblebee. So this was the furthest west the species had been detected, and it was right there in my front yard. So all this is to say that if you plant flowers, the bees will find them. You never know who's going to show up. So I know there's a lot of knowledge and experience in this audience, so I would love to hear from you. So what are your favorite flowers to plant for bees? So you can just drop your answers in the chat. I will let my colleagues moderate your answers, and I'm going to keep rolling here on this presentation. Okay, so bees don't just need any flowers, they need the right nutrition all season long. So nectar provides sugar, so this fuels adult bees for flight and daily activity. Pollen provides protein and fat. This is critical for larval growth, egg production, and overall colony health. Pollen is the only source of protein for bees. Flowers range anywhere from 2 to 60% protein and 1 to 20% fat. Plant diversity is so important for bumblebees. It helps meet their nutritional needs across the season. So when creating pollinator habitat, it's important to select plants that have overlapping bloom times from spring to fall. For early spring flowers, trees and shrubs are typically the first to bloom, can be valuable additions to your landscaping. You can also think about creating a system with diverse colors, shapes, and sizes across spring, summer, and fall. So spring is a critical period for bumblebees. Queens are in their solitary phase, and they require adequate nutrition to establish a healthy colony. In warm springs, bumblebees may emerge days before plants start flowering as snow melts early and soils warm up more quickly than air temperatures. So this is another reason to plant diverse early season flowers in your yard, and that provides access to hungry queen bees when they emerge. Flowers for bumblebees can also be scarce in the fall, so in order to survive the winter, queens need adequate energy stores. So having a diversity of late season flowers, like a lot of goldenrods and asters, these can help bees build up their reserves. So if you're just getting started providing habitat for pollinators, this slide shows the spectrum of possibilities, starting with a perfectly mowed lawn to a full wildflower meadow. What I want to say here is that you don't have to go from 0 to 100 to make a difference. Maybe you start mowing less, maybe you add a few native plants or a native tree or shrub, or maybe you stop using chemicals. The great part is that you don't need to do it all at once. Do what you can and figure out what works for you. These beneficial practices, they aren't about doing more, it's actually about doing less work. So less mowing, less tidying, fewer chemicals, less water. It's about making our landscapes less manicured and more welcome to wildlife. So from community gardens to container gardens to adding strips of wildflowers to your yard, you're making a huge difference for pollinators. So just a few considerations for selecting plants. Garden varieties are typically bred for characteristics desirable to humans, not necessarily for bees. So just because it blooms, it doesn't mean that it provides pollen or nectar, as shown here with this primrose. Some horticultural varieties and hybrids have been bred for double petals, and this actually means that the plant doesn't have the ability to produce nectar or pollen anymore. So when choosing plants, I recommend prioritizing native species. They're adapted to your local climate and soils, and they support a much wider range of insects. These plants are equipped to survive stressors like drought, harsh winters, poor soil without extra care. So gardening with native plants is a rewarding way that we can provide pollinator and wildlife habitat. So thinking beyond flowers, bumblebees also need shelter. Queens need to establish a new nest in the spring and find suitable locations to overwinter. This landscape shown here provides many options for shelter, but what can we do at our home scale to increase nesting and overwintering sites for bumblebees? So for a queen to find a suitable nest, she'll choose abandoned rodent burrows, rock piles, or some species nest above ground at the base of bunch grasses. You can consider integrating some of these into your landscaping. A lot of times for selecting pollinator plants, we forget about grasses, so remember the value of native bunch grasses. So generally doing less work in the fall is going to be better for bumblebees to overwinter. So they overwinter by burying themselves in dirt, leaves, compost piles, etc. It's really helpful to delay cutting back these old plants until the spring rather than doing it in the fall, and just generally be less tidy. Xerces has many resources available on this. And with habitat connectivity, we often think about movement of large animals like migrating elk or grizzly bears, especially where I live just north of Yellowstone. But connected habitat is just as important for bumblebees for genetic diversity and availability of food and shelter. In urban areas, suitable bumblebee habitat is often limited to areas along rivers, parks, and other locations, but we can act to create additional habitat and connect patches through corridors. So the food and shelter you provide for bees in your yard, your friend's yard across town, the pollinator garden in your park, these are all providing access for bumblebees to connect patches of habitat to wild spaces. And as a community, we can work together to provide pollinator habitat in multiple locations like roadsides, in parks, farms, and yards, which adds up to making a huge difference for bees. So if you're going to go through all the work of providing habitat for bumblebees, the last thing you want to do is kill them. But for whatever reason, home gardeners love to buy insecticides. This figure shown here shows the comparison of home and garden use in gray compared to the agricultural use of insecticides in black, with more money being spent on home garden use than on farms. Insecticides aren't regulated for home use, meaning that people could use higher concentrations or use more frequently than recommended. In the majority of homes and gardens, pesticides are just not needed. Plants that you buy at the nursery may be treated with pesticides and you might not even know it, so it's important to check your sources. Plants treated with systemic insecticides mean that pollen and nectar will be contaminated with those insecticides, and for perennials, this can last in the tissue of the plant for months or even years. Our pesticide team has an informative webinar on this topic. We also have a free guide about buying bee-safe plants if you want to learn more. The Xerces Society approach to pest management is to examine the system as a whole. So increasing biodiversity and creating habitat can boost natural pest control and reduce the reliance on pesticides. Another way to approach pests is through a slight change in attitude by recognizing that your garden plants will be chewed, nested in, dug out, and burrowed in, which is generally a great thing for insects. So I encourage you to get curious and watch what critters show up in your yard. So as you think about providing habitat for bees, a number of questions will likely come up, such as, what should I plant for pollinators? So Xerces has free region-specific guides to help get you started. We also have so many other resources available online, all for free. So make sure that you go and check those out. Those are all available at xerces.org/publications. So just to quickly recap, the ways that you can help contribute to bumblebee conservation is by planting flowers, especially native plants that bloom from spring to fall. You can provide nesting and overwintering habitat by generally delaying fall cleanup and leaving some untidy areas of your yard. You can help connect landscapes by encouraging your friends and family to provide pollinator habitat. And finally, you can provide a non-toxic environment by reducing or eliminating the use of pesticides. But there's one more very important action that you can take for bumblebee conservation, and that's by getting involved in community science programs like the Bumble Bee Atlas. So out of curiosity, I took a look at the observations that our staff has contributed to Bumblebee Watch. As a team, we're super passionate and we've observed about almost 4,000 bumblebees, which is a lot of bees. Now, this number doesn't show all the scientists doing research in the US on bumblebees, but it does go to show the limitations of scientists and our ability to cover ground for conservation. So just for fun, let's look at all of the Bumblebee Watch submissions. So look at this map. This is such a huge, impressive effort. So with your help, we've compiled information on over 200,000 bumblebees. In comparison, our staff have collected less than 2% of the total data. We couldn't do this project without you. We are immensely grateful for your contributions to bumblebee conservation. And with that, I will pass it over to Katie to share with you more about the Bumblebee Atlas program.
It's Michelle. Let me get my screen shared here. And I might go over our 3:30, or depending on what time zone you're in, a few minutes. So if you do have to jump off early, thanks for being here today. There will be a little survey at the end when you close this window. If you could take a few seconds to fill that out, let us know what you liked, what you missed. It really helps us improve our program. Okay, can everyone see my screen there? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Bumblebee Atlas program. Many of you probably are already familiar with it. If this is your first time learning about it, I'm going to give you a little overview and then direct you to your more regional or state-focused training. So this is a community science project that is aiming to track and conserve bumblebees throughout all of the green states highlighted on the maps here. We have many partners that help us run these programs that are from state agencies, federal agencies, many universities that all come together to make these programs work. And the way that the Atlas runs is that it's people-powered science. So if you haven't heard of community science, it's often called citizen science. It's an effort where we're inviting the community members to have a role in this research that we're trying to do. So with your help, we'll provide training, but this effort is really to build up a baseline data set, which is just simple data of what bees exist where on the landscape, what plants they're utilizing, what habitats they're found in, what times of the year we're seeing them, what other species they exist alongside, so that we can start to monitor populations, look at how their distributions are changing, and start to fill in some of those knowledge gaps regarding habitat associations, floral associations, what they might be using for nesting on the landscape. And all of that helps us to build these evidence-based recommendations, right? To really make some informed decisions when we're trying to put conservation actions together. So the way each project works is that they're set up using these equal area grid cells. So whether you're participating in Missouri, California, Oregon, Tennessee, Georgia, all of these projects run the same way, and they all have the same protocols, the same methodologies, the same data sheets. So everybody is conducting the same effort across the US. And again, anyone can participate, and we provide training for everybody, right? You don't have to have any prior experience to get involved with the Atlas. And the training events are a lot of fun. So you could consider this your part one of the training, right? You're learning about the importance of bumblebees and pollinators, some of the threats they're facing. But then we offer a part two where we sort of dive into the survey protocols, how to go out and actually look for bumblebees, how to swing a net, how to fill out the data sheets, how to photograph bumblebees, all the nitty-gritty stuff that's hopefully going to give you the skills and the confidence to go out and independently survey. And all of the data, like that Michelle was just showing on the map, is submitted to a platform called Bumblebee Watch. So if you've heard of iNaturalist or maybe eBird, it's a very similar platform that's collecting photo observations throughout the US and Canada of bumblebees. It launched in 2014, and every single photo that is submitted is verified by experts. So all of us here presenting to you today spend a lot of time looking at bumblebee photos and assigning them a species and getting you your feedback. So what we have here is a graph showing the number of observations that have been submitted to Bumblebee Watch since it launched in 2014. And you can see that the first couple of years, a few thousand observations came in, but when the first Bumblebee Atlas program was launched in the Pacific Northwest in 2018, you can see right away there was a huge jump in the number of observations that came in, right? So just by laying out some guidance, giving people some direction on how to go out and survey for bumblebees, giving them the knowledge, we really grew a lot of observations, and we've continued to expand to a new state or region each year since then. And I think Michelle's observation, her numbers were like 200,000, I think, which is a huge amount, right? And we have about 4,000 people that have submitted to Bumblebee Watch. So this effort is really improving our understanding of bumblebees at a rapid speed. The 7 of us on here could not collect this amount of data. And not only that, but these Atlas programs are really changing the patterns of data collection. So on the maps here, on the left is a county map of population density. So where it's red and orange, there's a lot of people. Where it's blue, there's not as many people. And the map on the right is showing iNaturalist bumblebee observations. So these are passive photos. You know, somebody might see a bumblebee in their yard or at school or in a park, and they submit that. And you can see that these two maps kind of line up, right? Along the West Coast and in the Northeast, we have a lot of people. So we're getting a lot of observations, which tends to happen with community science projects. You get a lot of data from city centers and along transportation corridors. But with the Atlas, one of the things we're trying to do is get people outside of urban areas, right? Into some of the more remote spaces, into some of those natural areas, to really help us understand how bumblebees are faring throughout the state. So here, when we switch to the map of Bumblebee Atlas data, you can see almost where some of these Atlas project states are happening. You can see Missouri, Nebraska, Minnesota, Idaho. They all start to come to light because we're getting so many observations. So I'll switch back here just so you can see one more time the difference between iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch. So pretty impressive. It's really great to see these numbers coming in. And this data is really lending itself to informing conservation and monitoring. A lot of the data has been used in research publications. It's created notes on nesting habitat. We've created a statewide guide on bumblebees of Nebraska. In the Pacific Northwest, they've developed species accounts and a summary of the project. So sort of looking at a detailed view of a species that shows some of its phenology, so when it exists on the landscape, the elevation profile, habitat and floral associations, as well as species distribution models. So where are you most likely to encounter a particular species based on habitat suitability. We've also developed habitat management guidance for Nebraska and the Pacific Northwest at this point that covers practices like grazing, haying, mowing, pesticides, fire. And as you've heard in the past presentations, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding these practices and how they're affecting bumblebees. But what we can do for landowners and land stewards that are interested in helping pollinators and helping bumblebees is give them the best knowledge available, right? Here's a particular practice that they might be employing on their land, and here's how it's likely to affect bumblebees. So they can take that knowledge and adapt it to their land. Our collaborators at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab have taken a closer look at some of the ecological associations. So the graphic on the left here is them looking at different species and what kind of habitats that they're most often found in relative to each other. So you can see like Aphanus, the rusty patch bumblebee, is highly associated with developed areas, whereas Bombus terricola or the yellow banded bumblebee is more likely to be found in forested areas. And then the graphics on the right are sort of looking at community structure across the state and how those species compare. So you can look at ecological region, the amount of survey effort that's been done, where the data point is coming from, and sort of teasing these apart, right? Learning about what different species need, and especially for the endangered rusty patch bumblebee, you know, how its needs might differ from, say, a common bumblebee and what we can be doing differently to help protect that species. Another cool item that's come out of the Atlas data is this statewide conservation strategy that was developed by Xerces Society for Washington State. It's a huge 250-page document that really goes into detail about the state's at-risk species, what people can be doing to support them, particularly for federal and state lands. And it has this really nice interactive dashboard where, say, somebody that works for the National Park Service can get on here. They can select, hey, I manage National Parks land. It'll highlight the lands on this map for them. It'll show them what species exist in their area, what some of the major threats are, and where some of the best habitat might be for those species. So really, really good tool for people to make some informed decisions. This year in particular, we've been able to help many states with their state wildlife action plan. And if you haven't heard of these before, every single state has one. And it's basically a comprehensive plan to keep track of species or habitats in every state that need conservation. And so if you've heard the term species of greatest conservation need, or when Amy was talking about our at-risk species, these are the individual species that these plans are trying to support. And to come up with that list of species of greatest conservation need, there are calculators, right? And these calculators take into account species observations. You can enter in the severity of different threat factors. You can use climate predictions. You can use a range calculator. And you sort of put all of that information together to determine a risk value. And so species with a higher risk value tend to get put on these lists. Basically, they're being flagged for we need to prioritize conserving these species in our state. And through the Bumble Bee Atlas, we've been able to share a lot of data on bumblebees to better improve the accuracy of these calculators. So the states are able to learn more about the bumblebees and which ones they need to keep track of. So if you want to explore the data yourself, we have this really nice dynamic dashboard on our website where you can zoom in and out of the data. You can look at specific species, you can look at a specific state, a specific year. You can really just play around with all of the Atlas data that's been collected to date. And then lastly, I just want to drive home again that this is community science, right? This project is really a way for you all to take action on conserving pollinators. And through these trainings and the in-person trainings, we always receive a lot of wonderful feedback from people that come for a variety of reasons, right? We have many people in here that are lifelong learners. Some maybe are nature photographers or educators, or maybe a family looking for a new activity to do together. People join this project for all sorts of reasons. So thank you for choosing to spend part of your Saturday, and we hope you join the Atlas. We've got a list of the part 2 trainings coming up soon. So if you take a look at this map here, you can find your state. If you go to the link here, maybe somebody can drop it in the chat. Our webpage, bumblebeeatlas.org, has an events page where you can go and register for part 2. And part 2 is where the regional coordinator will go over how to survey, how to identify bumblebees, what supplies you need, talk about permitting, all the stuff that you need to get out and get ready for field work. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors. Xerces definitely does not work alone. We have many, many people that support our work, many federal, state, nonprofit, private foundations, lots of people that help support Xerces. So again, if you enjoyed today's presentation, I'd encourage you to go on to xerces.org/donate. We've got a nice gift center where you can get yourself a cool habitat sign or a book. You can also just make a one-time donation, but it really is your contributions that make our work possible, especially in today's climate. So thanks again for everyone for joining us today. I'm going to leave up this slide that has our websites here, xerces.org, as well as bumblebeeatlas.org. You can find us on all of the social channels as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate everybody's contributions here, including those of you that were just watching. It's just wonderful to have this amazing bumblebee conservation community across the continent, and I feel lucky to be a part of it. So thank you for all of you, that all you're doing out there, and hopefully this information helps you learn more about what you can do at home, and hopefully inspires you to participate in our Bumblebee Atlas or other bumblebee community science programs that are available to you out there in the world. The question and answer here is full of amazing answers and amazing questions. We'll try to copy this information and make sure that it's shared along with the video on YouTube when it is shared, so that you can see some of the answers that are in there and learn from them. There's lots of great questions, and a lot of amazing knowledge in this room helped to answer those questions. And I'm sure all of you probably had more contributions you could have made as well. So sorry we went a few minutes over, lots of information, but really glad to have you all here on a Saturday afternoon. We'll be sharing this video when it's up. Thank you so much, and have a great Saturday.